do you know about the Civil War? Did you know that there was a Civil War within the Civil War? Few people realize that the people hardest hit by the Civil War were perhaps the five civilized tribes of the Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. These were the forgotten warriors of the Civil War. American Indians from these tribes fought for both the Union and the Confederacy during the war, with tribes often split against each other. Three regiments of American Indians who fought for the Union Army formed an Indian Brigade which had its headquarters here at Fort Scott, Kansas. When the war began, many Native Americans tried to enlist in the Union Army, but were turned down. A prominent Seneca chief was told by Secretary of State William Seward,
"Sorry, but this is a white man's war."
People west of the Mississippi were alarmed when their men were called by President Lincoln to serve in the East, where each side was concentrating their efforts to win the war. Kansans were especially upset since they were already bloodied by border warfare with Missouri. The threat of invasion haunted them since they were also close to the slave states of Arkansas and Texas. Their calls for protection fell on deaf ears as federal troops continued to be pulled from stations throughout the West. When Union outposts in the Indian Territory were abandoned, the South reacted by seeking alliances with the Indian nations and by sending in troops. That was where the tragedy of the Civil War within the Civil War and the forgotten warriors began. The Chickasaw and Choctaw readily sided with the South because tribal lands bordered with Texas. In addition, both tribes had originated in southern states and owned black slaves. The Seminole and Creek tribes were mostly opposed to an alliance with the Confederacy because they felt honor-bound to uphold treaties they had with the U.S. government. It split the Cherokee in the most bitter of ways. It led old tribal animosities from the removal days of the 1830s to burst back into the open. On the Confederate side were Stan Wadey and the mixed-blood Cherokees. They had supported removal. The full-blooded Cherokees and Principal Chief John Ross had opposed removal. They attempted to keep the tribe neutral, but their sympathies lay with the North. Pro-Confederate Indians were soon attacking their pro-Union brothers, driving them away from homes and farms. Creek Chief Opothayahola, who was pro-Union despite being a slaveholder, decided to take his band, along with some Seminoles and escaped slaves, north to Kansas. Confederate forces, consisting mainly of Choctaw and Chickasaw tribesmen, along with a few Texans, attacked his group 3 times. After being crushed in the third engagement, the old chieftain's group straggled into Kansas along the trail of blood on the ice, a battered and bedraggled group of refugees who left the bodies of 2,000 victims scattered on the landscape behind them. That was the way it went through much of the Indian Territory. It resulted in Kansas seeing an influx of thousands and thousands of pro-Northern Native Americans, most of whom ended up in refugee camps where conditions almost defied description. After visiting a camp, one Army surgeon described it.
"Their only protection from the snow upon which they lie is prairie grass, and from the wind and weather scraps and rags stretched upon switches. Some of them had some personal clothing. Most had but shreds and rags, which did not conceal their nakedness. Many have their toes frozen off. Few have shoes or moccasins."
Federal outposts attracted those refugees. Camps in the vicinity of Fort Scott soon had as many as 2,000 Native Americans lodged there. Had you asked any warrior in those camps what his greatest desire was, he would have told you that he wanted to return to his lands and drive the Confederates away. It was James H. Lane, Kansas senator and self-promoting military leader, who first proposed recruiting the refugee warriors into the military. Since the officer in command in southern Kansas, General James G. Blunt, was one of Lane's supporters, the plan soon bore fruit. The first Native unit to be sent to Fort Scott for training, the 1st Indian Home Guard Regiment, was organized in May of 1862 under the command of Colonel Robert W. Furness. It was composed of those who had taken part in the Creek Exodus the previous fall, which included Seminole Indians. The 2nd Indian Home Guard Regiment was organized in June, with Colonel John Ritchie in command. A variety of warriors had been recruited, not only in the camps, but at Kansas reservations as well, including Cherokees, Delawares, Osage, Quapaw, Caddos, Shawnee, Kansa, and Kickapoo. The muster rolls of both were filled with names like Billy Bowlegs, Spring Frog, Dirt Throat Tiger, and Stan Whirlwind. Commanding officers and their higher-ranking subordinates were white, while the junior officers were usually Indian. Not everyone approved of the experiment, as witnessed by this article found in the Fort Scott Bulletin.
Their principal use is to devour Uncle Sam's hard bread and beef and spend his money. They will be as valuable as a flock of sheep in time of action. They ought to be disbanded immediately.
Other residents feared that the Amerindians would turn their government-supplied training and weapons on white targets. But Colonels Furness and Ritchie forged ahead in trying to train and equip the natives, although they were given outdated weapons that often didn't work, and supplies condemned for use by white troopers. In June of 1862, the 2 Home Guard units and 8 white regiments were sent into the Indian Territory. The Indian Campaign, or Indian Expedition, had the objective of restoring the area to Union control. Indian families trailed along behind the Home Guard units as they hoped to reclaim the homes and farms they had been driven from. The 1st Indian Home Guard helped capture a unit of Missouri troops at the Battle of Locust Grove on July 3rd. This action convinced over 1,300 Confederate Cherokees to switch sides. This was enough to not only fill out the 3 remaining companies of the 2nd Indian Home Guard, but also to form the entire 3rd Indian Home Guard Regiment, which was organized at Carthage, Missouri, under the command of Colonel William A. Phillips. While the expedition was successful in recruiting more warriors, a retreat was ordered when supplies ran low and reinforcements failed to materialize. The original 2 Indian regiments were left behind, but they eventually retreated as well. Following behind were not only their families, but also the families of the new recruits, on the refugee trail back to Kansas and the dismal camp. General Blunt himself was well aware of the conditions in the camps as he made an appeal to help those who were suffering.
Your attention is called to the condition of the poor and suffering refugee Indians, mostly women and children now in Fort Scott. Great destitution exists among them for want of clothing.
That fall, the Indian Home Guard regiments were used in operations throughout southwest Missouri against bushwhackers and organized Confederate units. Union officers, though, declared the Osage unfit for duty and asked that they be mustered out. Their tribal dress frightened the whites, and they had a tendency to resort to their tradition of scalping and beheading the dead. They, along with many other Native American troopers, did not understand the white man's discipline and military tactics. They were often confused about whom to obey, their white officers or their tribal leaders. Many white officers in the Home Guard regiments felt that the Indians fought well. Major Albert Ellithorpe of the 1st Indian Home Guards commented in his diary after 2 different engagements in 1862,
"My regiment fought well. My regiment was engaged throughout the entire battle and the most of the time fought well."
But fighting bushwhackers and gray-clad soldiers was not what the members of the Native American regiments wanted to do. Again, Major Ellithorpe.
Today I went to the headquarters of General Blunt in company with 3 of the Indian captains. They are anxious to get into their own country and do not wish to be used as soldiers against none but Indians.
The Indian Territory itself was becoming a wasteland as both sides seemed bent on destroying everything that belonged to the other. Homes and farms were destroyed, livestock were either confiscated or slaughtered, and crops were burned. Guerrillas such as William Quantrill raided in the territory, as well as the refugee camps in Kansas, adding to the misery. Starvation became the constant haunt of families throughout the region. In the summer of 1863, General Blunt himself led an expedition into the territory at the same time that significant military actions were being staged at both Gettysburg and Vicksburg further east. All 3 Indian Home Guard regiments were part of the army that was victorious at Cabin Creek on July 2nd, and then proceeded, finally, to break the back of organized Confederate resistance at the Battle of Honey Springs, known as the Gettysburg of the Indian Territory. Blunt's attack on this most important Confederate camp in the Indian Territory succeeded because of superior artillery and gunpowder. The 2nd Home Guard Regiment played a key role in causing the collapse of the Confederate left flank, which in turn led to the collapse of the entire southern line. Guerrilla activity, however, had not ended for either side. In early 1864, the Indian Home Guard regiments went on a march through the southern part of the territory, engaging in Sherman-like destruction, laying waste wherever they went. Confederate Indians also proved more than adept at guerrilla warfare, especially the 2nd Cherokee Mounted Rifles under the leadership of Stan Wadey, the only American Indian to reach the rank of general in the Confederacy. Later in 1864, they destroyed a Union supply ship on the Arkansas River. In September, at the Second Battle of Cabin Creek, they decimated a huge supply train out of Fort Scott that was being guarded by African American and Indian Home Guard troops. The remaining months of the war found both sides content to launch small raids across the Indian nations. Native American units even continued to roam the territory after the end of the war. Stan Wadey became the last Confederate general to surrender when he laid down his arms in June of 1865. American Indian soldiers contributed to the overall Union victory, with many demonstrating their pride with war whoops sounding up and down the line as they rode into battle. They were successful in retaking the Indian territory, but upon returning to their home, they found conditions to be less than ideal. 10,000 people died during the war in the territory. 1/3 of Indian women were widows. 1/6 of the children were fatherless, while an additional 1/4 of the children had lost both parents. The loss of livestock and the end of slavery dealt a considerable blow to the tribe's economic systems. Making matters worse, the victorious Northern government took the view that all members of the 5 civilized tribes had sided with the Confederacy despite wartime service, and that all should pay the price of a defeated people. All pre-war territorial agreements were declared null and void. The Indian Territory slowly disappeared until its place was taken by the state of Oklahoma in 1906. A proud people caught up in a war that was not of their own making would suffer one final blow to their pride when the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1866 and containing these words:
Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians.
The Civil War brought great change to the United States. It brought about the abolition of slavery and laid the foundation for African American citizenship. However, the forgotten warriors of the Civil War would remain a forgotten people in regards to citizenship until 1924, after Indians had served as soldiers in the U.S. Army in 2 more wars.